apocryphal to everyone, but it was personally hugely important to me as a young adult when Dr. Heschel and my mother marched with Dr. King, and Rabbi Heschel explained that he was praying with his feet. Another side comment, if you haven't seen the movie Selma, please go and see it. Please see it as a reminder, for some of you probably a first ever exposure, to what was actually the case in this country in the 1960s. Please see it as evidence of the possibility of people mobilizing and organizing to make change. Whatever more we still have to do, whatever the recent reminders of the ugliness of racism in this country, it is a tribute to the power of religious leaders to organize for change. And please, and this is a totally personal comment, but please do not join, I love Rebecca's discussion this morning about the blogosphere and whatever, but please do not join the list of comments saying, guess what, Jews had a role in that too. Yes, but that's not the point of the movie. It's not the point of the story. And the unbelievable efforts in the last 3 weeks to rewrite history, I can't really tell you which one is worse. One is the effort by people in our community to say, but Jews had something to do with that, Jews were close to Dr. King, Jews helped to pay for that. And the other is the people who say that actually Lyndon Johnson would have done it all without Dr. King. Those are, in my mind, equally strange comments on an important moment in our history. So, we're going to move beyond me in a minute, but my personal life mantra for all of those too many decades in which I've been doing this work, as an organizer and a community activist first, then as an elected official, and now as the president of AJWS, I've basically been guided by Rabbi Heschel's teaching that in a free society where terrible wrongs exist, some are guilty, but all are responsible. American Jewish World Service is rooted in those teachings and those values, and what we strive for is what everyone in this room strives for. A world in which people have control over their own bodies, food, land, and water. A world in which people have freedom of speech and belief. A world in which people can freely participate in political decision-making. A world in which people can access both basic health care and education. And a world, as I said before, in which women, children, ethnic minorities, and other vulnerable populations can live with economic security and physical safety. That's not the world we live in. I'm talking more particularly now about the universe, part of the world that we inhabit. I want to share with you a few global concerns, a few statistics, but you need to promise me that you won't let these overwhelm. There are close to 1 billion people in the world who live with chronic hunger and malnutrition. They lack control over the food, water, and land they need to feed their families and to become economically independent. This in a world, that's 1 in every 7 people, in a world in which we now know that we have enough food to feed everyone. It is probably the case, estimates vary a little bit, that women are 70% of the world's absolute poor, the people who live on less than $1 a day. And we know, and we are getting a little bit more focused attention and exposure to the fact that those women and girls are regularly victims of violence and sexual assaults. There are between 10 and 18 million girls a year who are forced into early marriage. It's a problem in virtually every country, more acute in some than in others. But it's a problem with a universe of root causes. And so therefore, something that cannot be changed by cultural imperialism, by wishing it so, but only by a careful understanding of what are the reasons for this early marriage, who are the people in various countries who most want to make change, and again, what can we do to help them in that effort. And last statistic, same-sex relationships are outlawed in 77 countries in the world and punishable by death in 5. Okay, serious problems, no one's overwhelmed. The fact of being overwhelmed, I just want to say this, is it's a luxury. I don't mean that I'm that overwhelmed. There are days I get up and read the newspaper, and I'm only happy that all of the horrible news is not in the countries where I work, because I don't feel like I can take one more piece of bad news. So any one of those statistics, of course, is overwhelming. But we don't have the luxury of retreating to being overwhelmed. We're part of a people that is told to pursue justice and do what we can to heal the world. And we come from a tradition that says that to save one life is to save the world. The fact is that wherever people are challenged, and however badly they are challenged, they are organizing to fight back. And we are asked by our God, by our faith, by the world, to help them. Not to complete the task, of course, but to participate in the work, to step up and partner with God in making change. So, what are we doing? Let me give you some stories. In Uganda, there's a piece of legislation called the anti-homosexuality law. Ugandan President Museveni signed this horrible bill into law a year ago, intending to further criminalize the LGBTI community in Uganda. This legislation, I will remind all of you, is eerily similar to that section of the Nuremberg laws which stripped away the rights of Jews, just as the anti-homosexuality law strips away the rights of gays. One of our major efforts over the last few years at AJWS has been with pride to support an alliance of organizations. They're called SMUG, which stands for Sexual Minorities in Uganda. To support that alliance of groups that have been active in their own community in Uganda to protest and prevent the passage of additional anti-gay legislation. They know, and they have told us, that even before this bill was proposed, certainly even before it was signed into law, LGBTI people in Uganda face stigma, discrimination, violence, and enormous hurdles in accessing health care. So I just want you to think about that piece of it. It's one thing to be threatened with death for loving whom you love, but it's another to discover that as anti-gay sentiment is fueled by political leaders, the people who run health clinics, particularly health clinics providing services related to HIV and AIDS, are further forced underground. So service providers who work with sexual minorities face their own discrimination. Other service providers refuse to treat people or lack basic information about how to provide care. So today, both before the law and certainly since the law was passed, state-sanctioned hate against LGBT Ugandans is making it harder than ever to stem HIV transmission and contributing to a national public health crisis. So there's been some successes. Last August, so 8 months after the bill was passed, the Ugandan Constitutional Court ruled that the act was unconstitutional. This is largely due to the efforts of a single attorney named Nicholas Opoyo, an extraordinary activist whom we at AJWS are very proud to support. But even with his victory, we're not any place near where we ought to be. First of all, because state-sanctioned hate still is a threat. Second of all, because the law was overturned on an entirely procedural basis, which he felt was the only successful handle that he had. And we live in general fear of it coming back again. And we can talk more about that later if you have questions about it. But let me take you to the Dominican Republic, a country that, by the standards that I'm talking about, is a relatively peaceful, relatively calm country, which I suspect several of you have visited. Sadly, in the Dominican Republic, there was a ruling by the highest court of the country, which essentially threatened, this was a year ago also, to strip citizenship from 200,000 Haitian migrants and Dominicans of Haitian descent. The ruling is in direct violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which includes protection against discrimination, the right to nationality, and the right to identity. It is an ugly reminder of the use of official statelessness to marginalize and threaten a group of people. Sadly, this kind of discrimination is not new for Dominicans of Haitian ancestry. So there's a long story here, but Haitians left the evils of Haiti and the lack of employment options and went to work on the sugar plantations in the Dominican Republic. They were, this would sound a little bit like an American story, yes, they were welcomed when there was slave work to be done. And then they were entirely marginalized and neglected once there was no longer that work. They have since that time, for decades, been subject to routine arrests by the police, unfair detention, and in some odd cases, expulsion from the country without any notice of the ability to appeal. They've been the target of street crimes, hate crimes, and vicious crowd attacks. There's no law in the Dominican Republic that prevents people from, or that is against crimes that are motivated by racial prejudice and ethnic discrimination. And now, with this court decision, theoretically, as I said, 200,000 people could be sent to Haiti, a country where most of them have never been and do not speak the language. These are people who consider themselves Dominicans with Haitian ancestry, but their right to stay in the DR is threatened. So we're working with that community. We're supporting their organizing efforts and their legal challenges. We are looking, in this case, with a variety of other countries around the world for ways to protect their rights to live in the only country that they've ever known. I mentioned Burma before, so I'm going to tell you what's happening in Burma in case you don't know. And I'm going to tell you before I say this that I'm not getting this backwards. You'll see what I mean. In Burma, we are close to a genocide that's being perpetrated by fundamentalist Buddhists against the Muslim population. I just want to say that every single time I say this in a Jewish community, people say, no, you got it backwards, which tells you something about our own stereotypes. This is the Burmese government, a government which, if you read the travel section and the front page of the Times, is for sure, and this is true, a whole lot better than the fascist government that was in control, the military government that was in control in Burma. Burma is the country that the government calls Myanmar, but the people who live there call it Burma, so we call it Burma. But the government is better than the government that was. But in some eerie ways, comment on human nature, the immersion of a little bit of democracy makes it more possible for people to turn on each other. And so there have been huge efforts to try to protect what are called the Rohingya population, who live in Rakhine State in western Burma. There was, again referencing Rebecca's great presentation this morning, there was a very successful Twitter hashtag campaign called hashtag Just Say Their Name, which was actually designed to bring pressure on President Obama when he was there recently to ask about the future of the Rohingya, to actually mention them. And it did happen, and so at least the existing government is in some ways on notice that this is a concern of the world. Just one other example with some probably historical connections for a few of you, but one of the things that the Buddhist government in Burma has done, it has to take a census because it's supposed to be moving toward greater democracy and more elections. So it has to have a census. But it's told its census takers in Rakhine State to first ask what religion people are, and if they say they're Muslim, then not to count them. Okay, one more example and one personal story, because I don't want you just to be floating in large issues. A huge piece of our work, and by the way, there's no back table, but there's lots and lots of HWS literature here, and I promise you I'm not taking any of it with me. So you need not to only to take things that you want to read, but take a few for your community or your congregation, and then there's more on our website. Our biggest current campaign right now is called the We Believe campaign, and it's a campaign to address the global epidemic of violence against women and girls. In that regard, I want to tell you a story about Teresa, and then tell you about a piece of American legislation, and then we'll get to how you can help. The story is about Teresa, who lives in Nicaragua. Teresa married her husband when she was 19 and followed him to the community of San Rafael, where he owned a small piece of farmland. They had 6 children. They lived on their 4 acres of farmland in the mountains, and they farmed the land together. That's the good news. For 30 years, Teresa suffered physical abuse at the hands of her husband. She had no idea who to turn to, what to do, or what possible help there could be for her. And then a few years ago, her oldest daughter told her that her husband was molesting his daughters as they came of age. That Teresa and the oldest daughter then spent 2 years basically conspiring to never leave the younger girls alone. But Teresa had no place to go and no resources, knew she couldn't leave her children there, and felt paralyzed to take any action. And then one day she listened to the radio, a powerful tool in the Global South, and she heard a public service ad by one of our grantees, an organization called AMOAS, which stands for the Association of Entrepreneurial Women in Ohalah, Nicaragua. It's a group that is dedicated to decreasing violence against women, girls, and other young people by educating them about their rights, by promoting gender equality, and by expanding women's access to the judicial system. Because of the promise of this one radio ad that Teresa heard, she went to her brother and she decided to leave her home in San Rafael and travel to Ohalah to get help from AMOAS. On a day when her husband was away, she took all of her children, went to the AMOAS shelter. She was given support not only to stay in the shelter, but AMOAS supported her to press charges against her husband, and in 2011 he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. And AMOAS then worked with the Nicaraguan courts in a precedent-setting case to transfer title of the property to Teresa. So she is back in San Rafael with her children without the threat of violence and abuse. And if you want to see this story and a few others, just go on our website, because she tells it better than I. But I think you understand the point. We have endless. Somebody said to me before at breakfast, are you going to tell stories different from the ones you told last night? So I'm going to stop telling stories. But I think you understand now that we have many Teresas. We have many partner organizations and many, many stories. And we share the stories both when I speak and on our website so that people will see the human beings who are affected by our work. And again, understand that all of these are ways to make a difference. We at AJWS, and this is, in a minute we're going to get on to chatting with you, but I want to say we are interested in debating with people the tensions that come up. I think they come up every place, but for sure they come up in our community. The tensions between the local and the global, as if they were entirely disconnected. The tensions between the particular and the universal, as if somehow we were going to even individually choose one or the other and only pursue that path. I find that both philanthropists and activists are often persuaded that they should do local or they should do global, but not that they should do both. But as many people have noted, quoting Bill Clinton right now, we live in an interdependent world. We cannot escape each other. How we act locally has a tremendous impact on people's lives all around the world. And what we can do in Washington can make a dramatic difference for people tens of thousands of miles away. So, don't laugh, we have a new Congress. And whoever are the people in that Congress, we at AJWS, and I know all of you, want to do everything we can, everything in our power, right now, focus specifically on urging this government to support women like Teresa and countless other women and girls around the globe. There's a critical piece of legislation. It's called the International Violence Against Women Act, ohalah. It will promote the rights and dignity of millions of women and girls around the world if Congress would pass it. It's been introduced 4 times, starting in 2005. It represents what is in fact an unprecedented commitment by the US government to prevent and respond to violence against women and girls globally. If it was passed, it would fund innovative, cost-effective programs that decrease acts of gender-based violence worldwide, not by adding new money, which this Congress is never going to do, but simply by targeting money to the countries where the practice is most serious and to the grassroots groups like ohalah that are really making a difference on the ground. It would help to bring perpetrators of abuse to justice. It would stop some of the incidents of violence, allowing women and girls to do those things that we all take for granted. To be able to go to school, to be able to earn an income to sustain their families, to be able to collect food and water without fear of rape or harassment. Organizations like ohalah, of which there are hundreds, thousands in the developing world, would finally get a small piece of the official help and recognition that they deserve. So, the bill is very simple. Somebody worked with me on the Farm Bill. That was 730 pages of gobbledygook. This act is very straightforward. It says exactly what I just said. It would provide prevention, economic opportunity programs, public education campaigns. It would allow the US government to raise the question of the prevalence of gender-based violence in all of its negotiations with any country, and would require us to raise it in our dealings with some of the countries where this problem is the most severe. It would, if nothing else, move this crisis of violence against women and girls from being an invisible source of shame to being a public issue that governments are working to solve. So, Washington works slowly. Political climate is not great. And unfortunately, any mention, this is literally true, any mention of any piece of legislation that has women in the title is imagined by a distinct minority in Congress to be talking about abortion and reproductive rights, and it's not. So, we have a lot to do. The good news is that ohalah has been championed, I'm very proud to say, by amazing members of Congress.